Yeah, talking freedom and liberation. Worldwide, not just only for the nation. A radical guide, it's time to make changes. Bringing interviews and radical education.
Welcome to
a better
the Radical
future, what we
Podcast,
really need.
where we explore the stories, histories, and movements that reshape and challenge our understanding of the world. I'm Jason Bayless, your host, and today's episode covers a spectrum of powerful and inspiring topics. In our anarchist and radical news segment, we reflect on the global actions of November 25th, which are dedicated to eliminating violence against women, highlighting the fusion of feminist and anti-capitalist struggles. Our Resistance Around the World segment journeys through diverse global movements confronting capitalist structures, from environmental activism in India to grassroots labor movements in Argentina. And in About a Radical Guide, we'll discuss our engagement at the Howard Zinn Book Fair, an event celebrating people's history and fostering community dialogue. Join us as we explore and discuss these impactful movements and their role in shaping our journey towards a more just and equitable world.
Let's go!
In today's segment of Anarchist and AMP Radical News, we focus on the significant global actions that unfolded on November 25th, a day marked as the World Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. The Internationalist Commune's report sheds light on this day's importance, not just as a calendar event, but as a powerful symbol of resistance against patriarchal and capitalist violence. Link to the full report is in the description. Women across the globe use this day as a platform to demonstrate solidarity and resistance. The report underlines how patriarchal mentalities manifest in various insidious forms, from the objectification and sexualization of women to more overt acts of domestic violence and economic exploitation. This systemic oppression, deeply rooted in patriarchal and capitalist structures, calls for a vigorous response. The heartening aspect of these global actions is the emphasis on women's empowerment and the collective stand against oppressive systems. Women are encouraged to draw strength from their history, understand their power, and actively engage in resistance against all forms of violence, be it within toxic relationships, workplaces, families, or at the hands of the state. The global context of this struggle is particularly poignant. Amidst ongoing wars and the rise of authoritarian regimes, women's resistance emerges as a critical force in the quest for societal change. Initiatives like educational seminars and artistic performances are highlighted, showcasing creative approaches to combating patriarchal violence and fostering a collective shift in mindset. As we reflect on these actions, it's evident that the battle against capitalist modernity's violence is inextricably linked with the fight against patriarchy. The bravery and resilience displayed by women worldwide serve as a beacon of hope and a call to action for all of us in the pursuit of a more equitable and just world.
A radical guide, that's what this is. Highlighting the diverse world of resistance.
This week in Resistance Around the World, we turn our attention to anti-capitalist stories that often remain hidden in the shadows of global discourse. The reasons these narratives are less known are numerous. Media bias is a significant factor, as mainstream outlets tend to favor stories that align with the interests of their sponsors or political leanings. Geographical isolation also contributes, with stories from remote or less accessible regions struggling to reach a global audience. Another critical factor is political suppression, where governments and powerful entities actively work to silence voices of dissent. These stories, far from being mere side notes, are crucial for a comprehensive understanding of the full range of resistance against capitalist structures. The significance of these lesser-known stories is magnified in today's world, where economic and social inequalities are glaringly apparent. The struggles faced by these movements, be it against environmental destruction, exploitation of labor, or the diminishing of indigenous rights, mirror the broader systemic flaws of global capitalism. Bringing these narratives to the forefront helps us understand the diverse impacts of capitalism and uncovers alternative strategies and viewpoints that challenge the current system. For those committed to social justice, equity, and systemic change, engaging with these stories is more than educational. It's a critical part of our activism. They broaden our understanding of the global struggle against injustice, connecting localized issues to a larger pattern of resistance and solidarity. These narratives are not just distant accounts, they are integral to our collective movement towards a fairer world. Through exploring these stories, we hope to inspire you to recognize the ties between these global struggles and your own experiences, drawing strength and lessons for our joint efforts towards a more equitable society. As we transition into exploring individual examples of anti capitalist resistance around the world, it's crucial to understand the diverse contexts in which these movements have arisen. Each story we're about to share is unique, not only in its geographical and historical setting, but also in the ways it has been marginalized or overlooked in mainstream discourse. These movements, whether in remote corners of the globe or in the heart of major cities, often share common themes: a struggle against the encroachments of capitalism, a fight for local rights and sustainability, and a resistance to oppressive systems. However, their specific circumstances, challenges, and achievements are as varied as the cultures and communities from which they spring. As we dive into each example, consider how these movements, though possibly distant in space and time, resonate with current issues and struggles. Each provides a lens through which we can better understand the broader patterns of resistance and the shared human experience in the face of systemic challenges. So let's embark on this journey, uncovering these critical yet underrepresented stories of resistance and draw inspiration and lessons from each. The first example we will explore is the Narmada Bachao Andolan, India. The Narmada Bachao Andolan represents a pivotal movement in India's environmental and social activism history. It emerged in response to the construction of a series of large dams on the Narmada River, which flows through the states of Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, and Maharashtra. These projects, part of the Narmada Valley Development Project, were initially touted as essential for development, promising to provide water for irrigation, hydroelectric power, and drinking water. However, the environmental and social impacts of these large dam projects were profound and far reaching. The construction led to the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people, primarily indigenous tribes and rural communities, whose livelihoods and cultural heritage were deeply intertwined with the river and its ecosystem. Additionally, the ecological damage was significant, with extensive deforestation, alteration of riverine ecosystems, and loss of biodiversity. Despite its significance, the story of the NBA has not been widely known internationally, partly because it challenges the dominant development narrative often favored in global discourse. Large development projects like these dams are frequently portrayed as symbols of progress and economic growth, overshadowing the human and environmental costs. The Narmada Bachao Andolan, spearheaded by social activists like Mehta Patkar, began as a grassroots movement in the 1980s. It brought together a diverse coalition of indigenous people, farmers, environmentalists, and human rights activists united in their opposition to the displacement and environmental degradation caused by the dam projects. The NBA employed a variety of tactics in its struggle: grassroots mobilization. The movement organized numerous marches, rallies, and public gatherings to raise awareness and mobilize support. Legal challenges. They took their fight to the courts, challenging the projects on environmental and human rights grounds. International advocacy. Recognizing the role of international funding in these projects, the NBA actively engaged with global institutions like the World Bank, which eventually led to the withdrawal of their funding for the project. Satyagraha and hunger strikes. Embracing Gandhian principles, the movement also resorted to nonviolent resistance, including satyagraha, nonviolent protest, and hunger strikes. The NBA's struggle brought crucial issues to the forefront of the national and international consciousness, including the rights of indigenous people, environmental sustainability, and the accountability of large development projects. Their efforts led to significant dialogue and some policy changes regarding the rehabilitation of displaced people and the environmental impacts of development projects. From the riverbanks of India, where grassroots mobilization challenged large-scale development, we now shift our attention to Argentina, where workers took an extraordinary stand amidst economic collapse. The factory occupation movement in Argentina, emerging in the wake of the country's economic crisis of 2001, stands as a remarkable example of worker-led resistance and innovation in the face of capitalist collapse. This crisis, one of the worst in Argentina's history, was characterized by a severe recession, rampant unemployment, and a banking system collapse. It led to widespread social unrest and a series of governmental changes. Amidst this turmoil, many businesses, unable to sustain operations, closed down or declared bankruptcy, leaving countless workers without employment and livelihoods. The situation was dire. Workers faced not only the loss of their jobs, but also the broader collapse of their communities and local economies. The traditional responses to such economic crises, government intervention, reliance on external investment, or seeking alternative employment seemed inadequate or infeasible in this context. This unique situation led to an extraordinary form of worker resistance, the occupation and operation of bankrupt factories by the workers themselves. The movement was not a centralized or uniformly organized campaign. Rather, it was a series of spontaneous actions taken by workers in various factories across the country. The basic principle was simple yet revolutionary. If the owners have abandoned the factories and the state has failed to provide solutions, the workers would take over the means of production themselves. Key aspects of this movement included occupation and self management. Workers would occupy their closed or abandoned workplaces and restart the production under worker self management. This was a radical shift from traditional labor movements, which often focused on wage or condition negotiations. Legal battles and negotiations. These occupations often led to legal challenges, with workers having to negotiate with owners, creditors, and the government. In some cases, workers sought legal recognition of their cooperatives, navigating complex legal and economic landscapes. Community support. The movement gained significant support from local communities and other social movements, recognizing the effort as a fight against broader economic injustices. This support was crucial in sustaining the occupied factories. Sustainable and equitable practices. Many of the worker-controlled factories implemented more sustainable and equitable business practices, focusing on worker welfare, equitable pay structures, and community-oriented business models. The factory occupation movement in Argentina became a beacon of hope and a real-life example of an alternative to the capitalist mode of production. It challenged the traditional notions of property, labor, and economic recovery. The movement's legacy is significant, offering insights and inspiration to workers and activists worldwide, showcasing a different approach to economic crises and worker rights. Having seen the powerful response of Argentina workers, let's journey north to Canada, where indigenous communities spearheaded a crucial movement for environmental and cultural preservation. Idle No More is a significant movement in Canada, born out of the challenges faced by Indigenous communities and their resistance to capitalist exploitation of land and resources. While primarily centered on Indigenous rights and environmental protection, its narrative intertwines deeply with anti-capitalist resistance. Indigenous communities in Canada have long endured the consequences of capitalist-driven resource exploitation, which disregards sustainable practices and violates treaty rights. The catalyst for Idle No More was the introduction of legislative bills under the Canadian government, reflecting neoliberal policies that prioritized economic growth over environmental stewardship and Indigenous sovereignty. This legislation threatened further commodification and exploitation of Indigenous lands for capitalist gains. Idle No More evolved from local protests into a nationwide movement advocating for the recognition of Indigenous sovereignty and the protection of the environment against capitalist exploitation. The movement's stand against large-scale resource extraction projects like mining and oil pipelines represents a direct challenge to the capitalist model of indiscriminate resource use. Key aspects of Idle No More include opposition to capitalist exploitation. The movement strongly opposes the neoliberal capitalist agenda that prioritizes corporate interests and economic development at the expense of environmental sustainability and Indigenous rights. Promotion of alternative development models. Idle No More advocates for development models that align with sustainable and equitable practices, challenging the dominant capitalist paradigm that often marginalizes Indigenous perspectives and prioritizes profit. Global solidarity and resistance. The movement has forged solidarity with other global anti-capitalist movements, highlighting the shared resistance to the exploitative nature of capitalism, especially as it impacts marginalized communities and the environment. Education and raising awareness. Beyond protests, Idle No More plays a crucial role in educating the public about the intersections of Indigenous rights, environmental stewardship, and anti-capitalist resistance, contributing to a broader understanding of these interconnected issues. Idle No More's significance extends beyond Canada, resonating with global narratives of resistance against capitalist structures. The movement not only advocates for Indigenous rights and environmental protection, but also challenges the capitalist frameworks that perpetuate exploitation and inequality. From the struggle for Indigenous rights in Canada, we move to Australia, where environmental concerns and labor rights intersected in the unique and influential Green Bands movement. The Green Bands movement in Australia, predominantly active during the 1970s, is a compelling example of how labor unions can play a pivotal role in environmental activism. Originating in Sydney, this movement emerged in response to widespread public concern over the rapid and often reckless development that was threatening the city's heritage sites, low income housing, and green spaces. The Green Bands were initiated by the New South Wales Builders Labourers Federation, BLF, and represented a significant departure from traditional union activities focused solely on workers' rights. This movement's story remains relatively undertold outside Australia, despite its profound implications for environmental and social justice. It challenged the prevalent capitalist development model, which frequently prioritizes profit and growth over community needs and environmental sustainability. The Green Bands movement showcased a unique solidarity between the working class and environmental and community groups, fighting against the destructive impacts of unregulated capitalist development. The Green Bands were essentially a form of strike action, where construction workers, led by the BLF, refused to work on projects that were deemed environmentally or socially detrimental. This refusal to work was not for better wages or working conditions, but in defense of the community's right to a healthy and sustainable environment. Key aspects of the Green Bands movement include Labor Environment Alliance. The Green Bands movement was pioneering in its fusion of labor rights with environmental activism. It demonstrated that workers' rights and environmental protection are not mutually exclusive, but are interconnected issues in the struggle against exploitative capitalist practices. Community driven initiatives. The BLF often acted in direct response to community requests to preserve heritage buildings, public spaces, and affordable housing. This approach highlighted a shift in union activity from focusing solely on workers' issues to engaging with broader community concerns. Challenging capitalist development. The Green Bands movement directly challenged the prevailing capitalist development model by placing environmental and social considerations above profit. The movement's actions led to a significant rethinking of urban development practices in Sydney and beyond. Legacy and influence. The movement had a lasting impact, not only in the preservation of numerous heritage sites and green spaces in Sydney, but also in inspiring similar actions elsewhere. It showed how grassroots activism could influence urban planning and development, paving the way for future environmental campaigns that integrate labor rights. The Green Bands movement in Australia stands as a powerful example of the intersection of labor rights and environmental activism. It challenges the capitalist approach to development and highlights the potential of union and community collaboration in advocating for a more equitable and sustainable approach to urban planning and development. As we leave the urban development battles of Australia, our next stop is the global stage of the Plowshares Movement, where activists worldwide confronted the threats of nuclear militarism. The Plowshares Movement, with its roots in the global peace movement, is a unique and powerful expression of anti-nuclear activism. Founded on pacifist and ethical principles, this movement has been dedicated to opposing nuclear weapons and the broader militaristic structures that support them. Its origins can be traced back to the early 1980s in the United States, inspired by the Christian pacifist tradition and the symbolic act of beating swords into plowshares, as mentioned in the book of Isaiah. While the anti-war and anti-nuclear narratives have been prominent, the specific story of the Plowshares movement often remains overshadowed. It represents a more radical and direct form of activism against the nuclear arms race, one that not only calls for policy changes, but also takes direct action against the symbols and infrastructures of nuclear militarism. This movement challenges the capitalist and power structures that perpetuate militarism and the arms race, arguing that these are inherently linked to global issues of injustice and oppression. The Plowshares movement is distinguished by its approach of symbolic yet illegal acts of civil disobedience. Activists from this movement, often referred to as Plowshares activists, have engaged in a variety of direct actions to challenge and draw attention to the nuclear weapons issue. These actions typically involve breaking into military bases or weapons manufacturing facilities, damaging weapons or their components, and then waiting to be arrested as an act of peaceful protest. Key aspects of the Plowshares movement include symbolic disarmament. The activists' actions are seen as symbolic disarmaments, aiming to physically enact what they wish to see in the world, a dismantling of the tools of war. Ethical and religious foundations. Many in the movement are motivated by deep ethical and religious convictions, seeing their actions as a moral imperative in the face of the existential threat posed by nuclear weapons. Challenges to legal systems. The movement often brings activists into direct confrontation with the law. Their trials have been used as platforms to challenge the legality and morality of nuclear weapons, often bringing international laws and treaties into the argument. Global impact and solidarity. While the movement started in the US, it has inspired similar actions around the world, creating a network of activists united in their opposition to nuclear armament and militarism. The Plowshares Movement's approach to anti nuclear activism highlights the intersections between pacifism, ethical resistance, and anti capitalist sentiment. It challenges the militaristic and capitalist structures that underpin the nuclear arms race and promotes a vision of a world where resources are used for life affirming purposes rather than for tools of war. From a global movement of peace and disarmament, we now turn to the Himalayas, where the Chipko movement in India marked a significant chapter in both environmental activism and women's empowerment. The Chipko movement, originating in the early 1970s in the Himalayan region of India, stands as a seminal example of grassroots environmental activism, particularly noteworthy for its women-led resistance. The movement arose in response to the extensive deforestation in the Himalayas, which was not only an environmental concern, but also a threat to the livelihoods of the local communities who depended on the forests for sustenance. The deforestation in this region was driven largely by the demands of urban development and industrialization, often sanctioned by the government. These actions were undertaken without considering the ecological balance and the needs of the local population, reflecting a capitalist approach to natural resources that prioritizes profit and economic growth over environmental sustainability and community welfare. Despite its significance in the history of environmental movements, the story of the Chipko movement has not been widely highlighted, particularly in the context of global discussions on environmental activism. This omission overlooks the critical role of grassroots movements and the unique perspective they bring to the struggle against environmentally destructive policies. The Chipko movement is renowned for its distinctive method of protest, where villagers, predominantly women, embrace the trees to protect them from being cut down. This nonviolent method of protest was not only symbolic, but also highly effective in drawing attention to their cause. Key aspects of the Chipko movement include women-led activism. The movement was notably led by women, making it one of the earliest examples of feminist environmental activism. Women, as primary caregivers and collectors of forest resources for their families, were at the forefront, highlighting the gendered impact of environmental degradation. Community-centric approach. Chipko was not just about saving trees, it was about asserting the rights of local communities over their natural resources. The movement advocated for a model of sustainable development that prioritizes the needs and knowledge of local populations. Policy influence and environmental awareness. The movement's success led to a change in forest policy in India, including a ban on commercial logging in certain areas. It also played a crucial role in spreading environmental awareness and inspiring similar movements in other parts of India and the world. Legacy of sustainable development. The Chipko movement's advocacy for an ecocentric approach to development was ahead of its time, prefiguring later global discussions on sustainable development. Its emphasis on balancing ecological and human needs remains relevant in contemporary debates on environmental policy. The Chipko movement story is a compelling example of how local, community-driven resistance can have a profound impact on environmental policy and sustainable development practices. It challenges the capitalist framework of resource exploitation and underscores the role of grassroots activism in shaping a more equitable and sustainable approach to environmental management. Continuing our exploration of powerful women-led movements, we now dive into the Middle East, where Kurdish women have been redefining resistance against multiple forms of oppression. The Kurdish women's movement, particularly in regions like Rojava in northern Syria, presents a profound example of resistance against multiple forms of oppression: patriarchal, state, and capitalist. This movement, embedded within the broader Kurdish struggle for autonomy and rights, has often been overshadowed in the global discourse, which tends to focus more on the geopolitical and military aspects of Middle Eastern conflicts. The Kurdish regions have long faced political suppression and cultural marginalization, with Kurdish identities and rights frequently being denied or repressed. Women in these societies have faced the compounded challenges of both national oppression and deeply entrenched patriarchy. Additionally, the influence of capitalist structures in these regions has further complicated their struggle, often exacerbating inequalities and undermining community centric ways of life. The Kurdish women's movement has been a pioneering force in redefining the role of women in the Middle East and beyond, challenging traditional patriarchal norms and advocating for gender equality as an integral part of their broader political struggle. Key aspects of this movement include women's liberation as a central tenet. The movement places a strong emphasis on women's liberation, not just as a separate issue, but as integral to the Kurdish struggle for autonomy and rights. This approach challenges both traditional patriarchal structures and the state mechanisms that perpetuate gender inequality. Democratic confederalism. A significant aspect of the movement is its advocacy for democratic confederalism, a political philosophy that emphasizes direct democracy, environmental sustainability, and gender equality. This model presents an alternative to the nation state paradigm, proposing a decentralized system of governance based on community empowerment. Self defense and empowerment. Women in the Kurdish regions have taken prominent roles in self defense units, challenging traditional gender roles and asserting their agency in the struggle for self determination. These units are not just military forces, but also symbols of women's empowerment and resistance. Influence beyond the Middle East. The Kurdish women's movement has inspired feminists and activists worldwide, offering a model of how women's rights can be integrated into broader struggles against oppression. Their fight goes beyond national liberation to encompass a wider resistance against capitalist and patriarchal structures. The Kurdish women's movement's narrative is crucial for understanding the complexities of resistance in the Middle East. It challenges not only state oppression and traditional patriarchy, but also capitalist structures that exacerbate inequalities. By intertwining women's liberation with democratic confederalism, the movement offers a unique and impactful approach to social and political change. From the fight for women's liberation and democratic principles in the Middle East, we travel to Iceland, where citizens stood up against austerity measures in the wake of a financial crisis. The anti-austerity protests in Iceland, often referred to as the pots and pans revolution or the kitchenware revolution, emerged as a response to the country's severe financial crisis in 2008 to 2009. This crisis, part of the larger global financial meltdown, hit Iceland particularly hard, leading to the collapse of its banking system, significant economic downturn, and widespread public outrage. The crisis in Iceland was a direct result of rapid financial deregulation and the aggressive expansion of its banking sector, practices that were heavily influenced by neoliberal economic policies. These policies, favoring market liberalization and financialization, exposed the country to high levels of risk and ultimately led to the economic collapse. The public's response to this crisis and the subsequent austerity measures proposed by the government marked a significant moment of resistance against neoliberal policies and their impacts. The protests in Iceland were characterized by their peaceful, creative, and persistent nature. Citizens engaged in mass demonstrations, banging pots and pans, making noise to disrupt the functioning of the government and to demand accountability and change. Key aspects of the anti-austerity protests include grassroots mobilization. The protests were largely spontaneous, grassroots movements involving people from various segments of society. This widespread participation demonstrated a collective rejection of the government's handling of the crisis and its austerity measures. Demand for accountability. One of the central demands of the protesters was for accountability from those responsible for the financial crisis. This included calls for the resignation of key government officials and bankers and for legal action against those deemed responsible. Impact on governance. The protests led to significant political changes in Iceland. The government resigned and new elections were held. The aftermath saw the implementation of more stringent financial regulations and a shift in the country's economic policies. Direct democracy and civic engagement. The movement also spurred a surge in civic engagement and interest in direct democracy. This was exemplified by the crowdsourced constitution, an initiative to involve citizens directly in the creation of a new constitution. The anti-austerity protests in Iceland stand as a compelling example of successful resistance against neoliberal policies. The movement not only brought about immediate political change, but also inspired a broader discourse on economic governance, democratic participation, and the role of public protest in shaping national policy. Next, We shift our focus to Bolivia, where the water war in Cochabamba became a symbol of resistance against the privatization of essential resources and the encroachment of neoliberal policies. The water war in Cochabamba, Bolivia, in 2000 is a seminal event in the global struggle against corporate control and the privatization of natural resources. This conflict arose in the city of Cochabamba when the Bolivian government, under pressure from international financial institutions and driven by neoliberal economic policies, decided to privatize the city's water supply. This decision was part of a broader trend of privatization and market liberalization in Bolivia and Latin America, often encouraged by entities like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The privatization of Cochabamba's water system was awarded to a consortium led by a multinational corporation, which quickly led to a dramatic increase in water prices. These price hikes had a profound impact on the residents of Cochabamba, especially on the poorer sections of the population, for whom water suddenly became a luxury they could not afford. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that the privatization agreement even restricted people from collecting rainwater, further limiting their access to water. The response to this privatization was a massive and well-organized campaign that brought together a diverse coalition of participants, including farmers, factory workers, professionals, and others, transcending traditional social and political divides. Key aspects of the water war include grassroots organization and mobilization. The movement against water privatization was marked by extensive grassroots organization. It saw the formation of a broad coalition called the Coordinadora in Defense of Water and Life, which played a pivotal role in organizing protests and negotiations. Mass protests and civil disobedience. The campaign involved large-scale demonstrations, road blockades, and general strikes, effectively bringing the city to a standstill. The protests were met with harsh responses from the government, including declarations of martial law and military interventions, but the resistance continued. International attention and solidarity. The situation in Cochabamba gained international attention, highlighting the issues surrounding water privatization and the rights of communities to access basic resources. It garnered global solidarity and support from various international organizations and activists. Victory and reversal of privatization. The sustained pressure from the protests eventually led to the government's reversal of the privatization contract and the return of the water utility to public control. This was seen as a significant victory against neoliberal policies and corporate control of public resources. The water war in Cochabamba remains a powerful example of community resistance against the commodification of essential resources like water. It underscores the challenges and consequences of privatization policies in developing countries and highlights the potential of collective action in defending community rights and public control over essential resources. Our journey now takes us to Taiwan, where the Sunflower Student Movement marked a significant stance for political transparency and youth activism in the face of international trade challenges. The Sunflower Student Movement in Taiwan, which took place in 2014, is a pivotal yet often underreported example of student-led political activism in Asia. The movement was primarily a response to a proposed trade agreement between Taiwan and China, known as the Cross-Strait Service Trade Agreement, CSSTA. This agreement was part of a series of efforts to improve economic relations between Taiwan and China. However, it was met with significant suspicion and concern within Taiwan, particularly regarding the lack of transparency in the negotiation process and fears about China's growing influence over Taiwan's economy and politics. The movement was driven by concerns that the CSSTA would not only impact Taiwan's economic independence, but also potentially undermine its political sovereignty and democratic processes. Many in Taiwan viewed the agreement as a step towards increased economic and political dependence on China, a situation that raised profound concerns given the complex and sensitive cross-strait relations. The Sunflower Student Movement is best known for its occupation of the Taiwanese legislature, an unprecedented act in Taiwan's political history. Students and activists occupied the legislative yuan for about 3 weeks, demanding greater transparency in the trade deal's negotiation process and more substantial public scrutiny and legislative oversight of the agreement. Key aspects of the Sunflower Student Movement include student-led occupation. The occupation of the legislative yuan was a bold and symbolic act of civil disobedience, showcasing the students' commitment to political engagement and transparency. The occupation garnered widespread media attention and public support. Demand for transparency and public participation. A core demand of the movement was for a more transparent and participatory process in policymaking, especially regarding agreements that have significant national implications. This demand resonated with broader public concerns about democratic governance and accountability in Taiwan. Influence on Taiwan's trade and China policy. The movement had a substantial impact on Taiwan's trade policies and relations with China. It led to increased public scrutiny of cross-strait agreements and a more cautious approach to policy decisions involving China. Empowerment of civil society and political reforms. The Sunflower Movement empowered civil society in Taiwan, leading to the emergence of new political forces and a reevaluation of Taiwan's political landscape. It also spurred discussions and initiatives for political reforms, particularly concerning legislative processes and transparency. The Sunflower Student Movement's significance lies in its successful mobilization for political transparency and public participation in decision-making. It highlights the role of youth and student activism in shaping national policies, especially in the context of complex international relations and trade agreements. The movement stands as a powerful example of peaceful protest leading to tangible political change and greater democratic engagement. Finally, we conclude our global tour of resistance in Lebanon, where economic hardship and political corruption ignited a widespread movement calling for profound systemic change. The 2019 to 2020 Lebanese protest movement, also known as the October Revolution, represents a significant moment of resistance in the Middle East, particularly in Lebanon, a country with a complex history of political and sectarian divisions. This movement was triggered by a combination of long-standing economic hardships, political corruption, and a lack of effective governance. Lebanon's economic situation had been deteriorating for years, marked by high unemployment, soaring debt, and severe economic inequality. The government's proposed imposition of new taxes, including a tax on WhatsApp calls, in the context of these economic woes, was the spark that ignited widespread public outrage. This movement is notable for its representation of widespread discontent with the existing sectarian political system in Lebanon, which has often been criticized for perpetuating clientelism, corruption, and inefficiency. The protesters' grievances were not only economic but also deeply political, demanding a complete overhaul of the political system. The Lebanese protest movement of 2019-2020 was characterized by its inclusivity and the diversity of its participants. People from various religious, social, and economic backgrounds came together, transcending traditional sectarian divides that have long characterized Lebanese politics. Key aspects of the movement include broad-based participation. The movement saw widespread participation across Lebanon, indicating a collective awakening and a unified stance against the ruling elite. It was marked by a notable presence of young people who played a significant role in mobilizing and organizing protests. Innovative protest methods. Protesters employed a variety of methods, from traditional street demonstrations to innovative forms of civil disobedience. This included road blockades, sit-ins, and the use of social media to organize and spread their message. Demand for systemic change. One of the key demands of the movement was the dismantling of the sectarian political system, which many Lebanese view as the root cause of corruption and inefficiency in the country. Protesters called for a new, non-sectarian political system that ensures fair representation and accountability. Economic and political impact. The protests had significant short-term and long-term impacts. In the immediate aftermath, the government resigned, and discussions around political reform and anti-corruption measures gained momentum. However, the economic situation continued to worsen, exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the Beirut port explosion in 2020. The Lebanese protest movement highlights the complexities of fighting against deeply entrenched political and economic systems. It underscores the power of collective action and the role of grassroots movements in challenging the status quo and advocating for profound systemic change. As we conclude our journey through these remarkable examples of resistance around the world, we've seen a diverse tapestry of movements, each unique in its context and approach, yet united in their struggle against various forms of oppression and injustice. From the environmental activism of the Narmada, Bachao, Andolan, and the Green Bands to the groundbreaking feminist approaches of the Kurdish women's movement, these stories illuminate the myriad ways in which people have stood up to challenge and resist. We witnessed the impactful factory occupation movement in Argentina, a beacon of hope in the face of economic collapse, and the inspiring Idle No More movement in Canada, advocating for Indigenous rights and environmental stewardship. The Plowshares movement's commitment to peace and disarmament, the Chipko movement's pioneering role in ecofeminism, and the Lebanese protest movement's call for political transformation each offer valuable insights into the power of unified action. The anti-austerity protests in Iceland and the water war in Cochabamba remind us of the strength of community mobilization against neoliberal policies and privatization. And finally, the Sunflower Student Movement in Taiwan highlights the role of youth activism in shaping trade policies and political transparency. Each of these movements, while perhaps not widely reported or recognized, contributes significantly to our global understanding of resistance and offers lessons in resilience, solidarity, and the pursuit of justice. I invite you to reflect on these stories and consider their relevance to our current challenges. Please let us know if any of these movements have sparked your interest and you wish to delve deeper into their histories and impacts. Your engagement and curiosity fuel this journey of exploration and understanding, and we are here to delve into the stories that resonate most with you. Remember, the fight for a more just and equitable world is ongoing, and learning about these movements is not just a history lesson, it's a source of inspiration and a guide for our actions and advocacy.
Radical education, yeah, a better future, what we really need, not rooted in capitalism or supremacy.
Next week, we won't be releasing a new episode of our podcast, as a radical guide will be at the Howard Zinn Book Fair. We'll be immersed in this annual celebration of people's history, bringing together authors, readers, organizers, and community members for debates and discussions that shape our understanding of the world. Scheduled for December 3rd at the City College of San Francisco's Mission Campus, the Howard Zinn Book Fair stands as a crucial counterpoint in an era of historical amnesia. We're excited to be there, documenting important conversations and insights. Let's take a moment to explore the list of panels that a radical guide will document in partnership with PM Press and the Howard Zinn Book Fair. Panel 1, Building the Future in the Present, Lessons from Cooperation Jackson. We'll explore insights from Callie Akuno and Sacagawea Hall about building a solidarity economy. Another panelist in this conversation is Matt Meyer. Their collective experiences and strategies promise to offer invaluable perspectives on resisting conventional capitalist structures. Panel 2, Fiction, Unafraid of Politics. This panel features Kim Stanley Robinson, highlighting how fiction can engage with socio-political issues. Other panelists in this conversation are Karen Joy Fowler, Terry Beeson, Summer Brenner, and Joseph Matthews. Together, they bring a rich diversity of narrative styles and thematic explorations, intertwining fiction with political realities. Panel 3, Then and Now, Socialist labor organizers from the 70s and 80s who never gave up. Capturing the stories of labor organizers like Jonathan Melrod, we'll dive into the enduring spirit of labor movements. Other panelists in this conversation are Steve Pitts, Peter Olney, and Warren Marr. Their combined experiences offer a deep dive into the heart of past and present labor struggles. Our participation in the Howard Zinn Book Fair is an extension of our mission at A Radical Guide to document and share stories that challenge, inspire, and provoke. These panels are crucibles of knowledge and resistance, crucial in today's narrative-rich landscape. While our regular podcast schedule takes a brief pause, we encourage you to stay connected for our coverage of the book fair. Expect the same depth and insightful commentary, now enriched with the perspectives and discussions from this event. Join us in this journey of intellectual engagement and historical celebration at the Howard Zinn Book Fair. It's more than an event. It's a manifestation of our continuous quest to understand and shape our world through the lens of people's history. If you're going to be there, please stop by and say hello.
Let's go.
As we conclude today's episode of A Radical Podcast, I want to express my deep gratitude to all of you for joining us on this journey. We've traversed through impactful narratives of resistance, from the global actions of November 25th to the heartening anti-capitalist movements around the world, and our upcoming involvement in the Howard Zinn Book Fair. I hope to see many of you there. If our work resonates with you, please consider showing your support by leaving us a tip. The link is in the description, and your contributions greatly aid us in continuing this important work. Also, don't forget to subscribe for more thought-provoking episodes. And remember, If you come across a location that embodies the spirit of radical change, share it with us by adding it to the Radical directory at radicalguide.com. Until we meet again, keep resisting, keep fighting, and stay radical.
Yeah, talking freedom and liberation. Worldwide, not just only for the nation. A radical guide, it's time to make changes. Bringing interviews and radical education. Yeah, a better future, what we really need. Not rooted in capitalism or supremacy. Yeah, trust, you don't want to miss it. We bring the truth right to you, the past, present, and future. Let's go. A radical guide, that's what this is. Highlighting the diverse world of resistance. Let's go.